Good evening. I'm Dick Clay. I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. And it is wonderful to have all of you all on this evening as we learn from Jessica Whitehead. Thank you again for joining us for this evening's presentation. Jessica K. Whitehouse is the curator of collections at the Kentucky Derby Museum. In addition, she is an independent writer, artist, and curator who focuses on themes related to the natural world and the arts. She has curated several shows of Harlan Hubbard's artwork, including Kentuckiana Sublime, New Perspectives on Nature, in 2013 at the Kentucky Museum of Art and Craft, and That Wildlife, the woodcuts of Harlan Hubbard from 2018, which she did that year at the Louisville Grows Healthy House Gallery. Jessica is a graduate of Hanover College, which says something about the liberal arts education she's received and her roots in this area and the ties that Hanover College had to Harlan Hubbard. So she'll speak tonight with enormous authority, and I think we're all going to love this one. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. So please join me in welcoming Jessica Whitehead. Jessica.
Okay, well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Really a special thank you to the Filson for inviting me back here. I am so happy to be talking with you all, and I really just love being able to share the joy that is Harlan Hubbard. He can speak to so many different people in so many different disciplines, and he really is something very special that we in this area should be very proud of him. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here for you, and we will get going. Okay. So I wanted to start this evening with a little something Harlan Hubbard wrote in his journal on Thursday, January 20th, exactly 84 years ago in 1938. And he said, "I have no assurance that my life will ever be as I plan. It never is. I have been on long walks when at times the way is tiresome, and I'm looking forward to reaching some longed for place, a town, a river, or the canyon opening into the valley. In my mind, I see how it will look, how the road will approach it. Then the road will go over another range or follow another creek instead of this one, or make a change in direction. Perhaps I may change my course, seeking a new goal. So is my life now as it goes on. The future will never be what I expect. That alone is certain." Now, at the time Hubbard is writing this, he's 38 years old, he's single. He's living with his mother, Rose, at the home he built for them in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. And all in all, he's living a very different life than the one we have come to know him for. He's been keeping a modest painting studio in his bedroom on the second floor of this house in Fort Thomas. And he's been churning out works in oil and watercolor, but he's since run out of room to store them in those pokey closets and those narrow crawl spaces in this craftsman home. So he's also been designing and building a small but really elegant brick studio toward the back of this Fort Thomas lot, using the carpentry and masonry skills that he's learned over decades working as a contractor, mostly to supplement the more modest income he'd come to expect from the sale of his paintings. And so when the studio is complete in March, he moves his paintings into their new home. And he says of them and of himself, "I would not be concerned if all that I have done were destroyed. In times of enthusiasm, when I tried hard and felt that I was working along new lines which would change my painting or style, the work produced was likely to be bad. The best was done easily, naturally, without constraint, almost unconsciously. Now, Harlan Hubbard was at his most easy, his most natural, his most unconstrained, when he wasn't pretending to like the life that he was having there in Fort Thomas at that moment. But when traditional society had no more expectations on his time, when his mother had no more expectations on his time, shuttling her about to some errand or another across the river in Cincinnati, when society had no more expectations of him for a day or maybe for a couple of days, he would take to the hills of Campbell County, Kentucky, or to the Ohio River. He had a canoe and a john boat that he would use, and he would go on long expeditions up the Ohio River and on its tributaries. And there, in nature, his sketchbook in hand or propped on his knees, he'd scramble to really capture this visceral experience of the world he was experiencing. And he would turn to the conveniently portable medium of watercolor. Or perhaps he would go back to his studio, still hovering in these landscapes that he was just in, and he would create exactly the kind of almost unconscious works that he and we, as you'll see, can see as some of his best works throughout his life. Now, when Bill and Flo Cadell and I conceived this book celebrating Harlan Hubbard's watercolors, we were a little daunted by this task. Hubbard created hundreds, if not thousands, of small-scale studies and finished pieces in watercolor over the course of his long career, and the majority of them reside in Bill and Flo's collection. How are we possibly going to choose among these hundreds and hundreds of beautiful, luminous watercolors? But choose we did, a feat made possible by Flo Cadell and her firm, but kind diligence in the face of each of us inevitably saying about the no pile, but what about this one? Shouldn't we include this one? But we chose. The result was this stunningly beautiful volume that was elegantly edited and designed by the folks at the University Press of Kentucky. And it features over 200 full color reproductions of a selection of these Hubbard watercolors from the Cadell collection. I was privileged to write the introduction for the book, but we were also very fortunate to have Peter Marin write a very lyrical foreword. And Bill and Flo also lead the charge in a number of heartfelt and inspiring personal essays that punctuate Hubbard's luminous watercolors. It's really a unique publication and one that we really hope is going to pique the interest of art lovers near and far. So the Cadells and I had a few goals we wanted to accomplish with this publication. First, we were really eager to share this bounty of watercolors that haven't really been widely exhibited or seen in years past. Peter Marin, who wrote the foreword to this book, and John Begley teamed up with the Fraser Museum a few years ago to do a large and really lovely exhibition of many of the watercolors in this book. But many of the most diehard Hubbard lovers have never seen one of his watercolors or hadn't up until that exhibition. Second, we also really wanted to recalibrate the critical understanding of Harlan Hubbard. While I expect the percentage has probably increased somewhat over the course of the past decade, most people who have heard of Harlan Hubbard know him for his writing or for his lifestyle, not necessarily for his prolific artistic body of work. And this is especially true outside the Kentuckiana region, where Hubbard has enjoyed relatively little notoriety on any score, except perhaps through his published books. So the Cadells and I are not only eager to expand the national consciousness of Hubbard's watercolors, we're also eager to expand the national consciousness of his artwork, period. And we want to do this partially because the work deserves the recognition, but we also recognize the intense relevance of Harlan Hubbard's life and his example to our contemporary world. If we're able to make the public curious about Hubbard through these beautiful watercolors, we're also afforded the opportunity to make the public curious about what that art represents. particularly the increasingly important values of environmentalism, of conservation, of sustainability, and a general reverence for the natural world. Finally, we wanted this publication to be another step toward building a new generation of Hubbard lovers and scholars. And this volume contains a number of testimonials to the ability of Harlan Hubbard's life and work to transform lives. And many of those testimonials are delivered by people who were privileged to have met and known Harlan and Anna Hubbard personally. However, as is the case with me, who was born the year following Hubbard's death, the majority of people now who come to Hubbard's work will never have the opportunity to meet him or to speak with him. And in this sense, it's becoming increasingly important to publish on his legacy, so his important example remains in the public record for generations to come. And I want to share a great selection from Bill and Flo's preface to this book, where they speak very eloquently to this idea. They say, "The Hubbards will always transfix the imaginations of those searching for a calmer, more harmonious way of life. Out of deep admiration, some people have named children after Harlan, created art channeling the spirit of Harlan, written fiction and nonfiction inspired by the Hubbards, built energy-efficient homes, moved to places where a closer connection to the earth might be possible, or reordered their lives to be more in tune with the Hubbard spirit." And to me, this really begs the question, what does it look like to be in tune with the Hubbard spirit? What is that essential quality that makes something or someone Hubbardian, if I can use that term? And to me, it really has something to do with the profound, life-altering, and conscious integration of hard work and beauty into day-to-day life until the two are virtually indistinguishable from one another. For Hubbard, he received daily, if not hourly, commissions to live this way. And often those commissions were catalyzed by these meaningful encounters he was constantly having with a beloved natural setting that could feed this cycle. And his hard work included the physical labor of building homes and hiking hills, in rowing boats, but also of exercising his curiosity through voracious reading, continuous journaling, and also musing on art, history, philosophy, playing instruments, hearing concerts, and of course, painting. He really encapsulated something of a Renaissance man in terms of the level of his interests and how numerous they were. And in 1930, Harlan Hubbard wrote in his journal, "There should be something more in a picture than what we see. It is impossible that there should not be more. A cross between conscious painting directed by principles and free play of the artist's mind. This too is inevitable since the mind cannot be perfectly controlled and directed, and art at its earliest stage has formulas. Above representation is harmony of line and color, and above that, mood or feeling or reaction of the artist's mind to what he sees." So where do the watercolors fit in this definition? Where do the watercolors fit in this hierarchy that Hubbard has presented us? How are they complying to his order of principles? And what is this mood or feeling that Hubbard mentions that should be the core takeaway from one of his paintings? And in the foreword, Peter Morin really begins to put words to this. He says, "Hubbard's sense of his artistic self is fully integrated with the riverine landscapes he depicted. There's an explosive energy to the immediacy of these works and their invitation to the imaginary hikes and voyages they propose to the viewer. Hubbard did not merely observe. The heightened engagement in his depictions is more fitting for the connotations of the word behold. While Hubbard proclaimed himself a realist, his work interrogates his emotional engagement with the natural world and treasures up his intoxication with the vistas he represents." And I pick up this thread in my essay, Personal Wildernesses, which is the introduction to this book later on. And I'll read a passage of this to you now that sort of sets out what I'm looking to cover in this lecture. The poetics of Harlan Hubbard's imagination, evocative as they are in his words, transcend written language. They find higher and more varied expression in the visual language of his painting, especially in his regular use of watercolor. The overwhelming majority of Hubbard's paintings in watercolor depict the landscape around him. Through this sub-oeuvre of artwork, we can see the compelling proof of an artist who was called in every time and every place by the land and water of America. He answered that call with vibrant color, jubilant line, and free movement, often enhancing his undulating strokes and washes with a contrasting swipe of a stick of charcoal. In them is preserved the freshest, most unstudied, more fundamental demonstration of Hubbard's painting technique, a technique only enhanced by the unstructured medium of watercolor. Sometimes barely more than sketches, sometimes scrawled out in a journal or on the back of a letter or receipt, and sometimes verging on the world of abstraction he often derided in his writing, Hubbard's many watercolors offer us a window into the soul of a man whose deepest desire was to be simply and unequivocally authentic, to be honest, raw, and real, like the natural world he had spent so long trying to understand. Okay, so if Peter Morn and I are saying that these watercolors are so great, why haven't they become better known by now? Why hasn't his art in general gained the critical recognition on really the national level that it deserves? And to me, authenticity is the key word here, and not just to me, but also to Wendell Berry, who in his lovely meditation on Hubbard's life and work, he calls Hubbard's aesthetic an aesthetic of authenticity. And it is this authenticity that suspends his artwork in this kind of strange paradox that we'll discuss tonight. And Peter writes, there are many reasons for the critical and popular neglect of the artist and slighting of the reputation he deserves. Hubbard's self-imposed separation from the business world and his ambiguous attitude toward the monetary aspects of being an artist, despite participation in over 30 lifetime exhibitions, militated against critical recognition. Hubbard's embrace of a Thoreauvian lifestyle has brought attention to him primarily as a journal keeper, environmentalist, and principled dissident from an all-encompassing commercial and industrial consumerism, rather than to his art, which was always his first profession. Ironically, some of the reasons for Harlan Hubbard's lack of reception for his art are precisely the factors that are most compelling for its aesthetic success. His defiance of convention in lifestyle as in his art demands of the viewer an equal rejection of convention to appreciate his achievement. And I continue on this line of thought, citing Berry's aesthetic of authenticity as really the major factor keeping Hubbard's work from reaching a larger, more receptive audience. Oops, and I think went too far. Nope. Okay. There we go. Hubbard's authenticity, which hinged on his distrust and dislike of traditional society, was the agent of his own frustration. And Hubbard was consistently frustrated by his reception in the art world. In many ways, the watercolors are most representative of who Hubbard was as a person. They carry with them the literal acknowledgement of a philosophy that isolated Hubbard from traditional modes of the working artist, but also elevated him to a position of ethical authority. Often painted on the water and in the hollers of whatever part of the country he happened to be in at the time, the watercolors are a visual reminder of Hubbard's staunch commitment to and affinity for his subject. So Hubbard was not a salesman. He didn't buy into the idea of marketing himself. He was not interested, as many artists have to be, in convincing people why his art mattered. He wouldn't do well in the Instagram and Facebook age. And it mattered to him, this art. And that was enough most of the time, some of the time. But especially after the death of his mother, for whom he gave loving care for 44 years of his life. And after his marriage to Anna Eichenhout, who became his wife in 1943, when he was freed from these familial obligations and became empowered to seek a life on the fringe of society, as he terms it, the artwork he created was an extension of his selfhood more than a means of making a living. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, so if Hubbard worked so hard to separate himself from the contemporary world, how separated was he from the contemporary art world? Did he know much about art history? Did he follow current trends of 20th century painting? Was he self-taught? And the answers are resounding. Yes, he was a lifelong student of art history. Yes, he kept abreast of all of the current 20th century trends in artwork. And no, he was not self-taught. In fact, Hubbard's early life was filled with art and creativity. He was born in 1900 in Bellevue, Kentucky, and yay for people born in 1900 because it makes knowing their age at any given year really easy. But he was born in 1900 in Bellevue, Kentucky, right across the river from Cincinnati. And those beaches there along the Ohio River in Bellevue, where he spent many of his early days playing with his brothers and their friends, it was in view of the tall brick standpipe that's in Eden Park, where the Cincinnati Art Museum is. So it was always beckoning to him from across the river. And he visited the museums and galleries of Cincinnati often, attending lectures and openings, and even becoming part of an art society for a while. And often he would be doing this with his brother, Frank, who was also an artist and an extremely skilled draftsman. And actually this picture here that we're seeing on the screen, this sketch, this is a sketch of 6-year-old Harlan. It's a little meta because it's 6-year-old Harlan sketching in a sketch, but it's by the hand of Frank Hubbard, his brother. And Frank bought Harlan his first sketchbook. He gave Harlan his first drawing lessons. Later, Frank would buy Harlan his very first set of oil paints, and perhaps also bought him his first set of watercolors too. And Frank's influence would keep Harlan, albeit loosely, sometimes tethered to the contemporary art world. And this is something that consciously or unconsciously had a stylistic effect on Harlan Hubbard's artwork across all the mediums, but it's especially evident in his watercolors. And in fact, Frank's influence, had it not been for Harlan's mother, Rose, as I mentioned, whom he cared for 44 years of his life, had it not been for Harlan's mother, Rose, wanting to go back home to Kentucky after the place that I'll tell you about where they were living, Frank's influence really might have continued to pull him further and further into the traditional art world. And it's this really strange alternate reality that even Harlan alludes to in later life. He calls it his blind alley. And the zenith of this blind alley took place none other than in New York City, New Art City, where Harlan, his brothers, Frank and Lucian, and his mother all lived from 1915 to 1919. And Harlan lived with his mother in a small apartment. It was a tall brick apartment building on the Grand Concourse. And in 1917, his brother Frank helped Harlan fill out an application to the National Academy of Design in Manhattan, and perhaps helped him assemble his portfolio, prep for his interview. Harlan was accepted, and he actually trained at the National Academy on and off until 1919. And those of you who are a little bit more familiar with Hubbard's biography will know that these years, when I say on and off at the National Academy, this is because during wartime, during World War I, Hubbard, like many young men, although he was not conscripted into the army, did assist on farms in upstate New York, trying to keep them going while many of their farmhands were fighting in Europe. And when he was in upstate New York, he learned a lot of the skills and a lot of the interest he had in sustainable farming. And he also read Thoreau for the first time up in upstate New York during that period. So a very formative time for him in upstate New York as well as in New York City. But the National Academy wasn't necessarily where Harlan was getting most of his education. In fact, he was sort of wishy-washy about whether he actually learned anything at the National Academy, saying it was more of a nice, dry, warm place to sketch during the day. But Harlan, his brothers Frank and Lucian, when they had free time, would spend their days taking in the playground that was New York and New York City. Now, Lucian, who was really more interested in hiking along the Palisades or canoeing on the Hudson River, would take Harlan on adventures into nature. And Frank, already working as a commercial artist in the city, so very interested in art, would take Harlan on adventures into culture. And Harlan's mother, Rose, incidentally kept really interesting daily journals of their time in New York. She also kept them every year from 1907 until her death in 1943, and has a daily entry for every day during that period. But she kept daily journals of their time in New York, which is really helpful because I'm able to see some of their comings and goings while they were there. And in them are many references like this one you'll see. Saturday, January 22nd, 1916, Frank and Harlan went down to the museum. We see that a lot in these journals. And indeed, Harlan talks about going on these trips with Frank and Frank's wife, Frances, to whom he was very close as well. Going with Frank and Frances out to the museums and galleries of New York City. And he said, I visited current shows at private galleries where entrance and exit looked easy. I stumbled on a post-impressionist exhibit and saw my first Cézanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh, at once recognizing that here was a new departure. Till then, nothing enticed me beyond Impressionism. Yet, I did not enter into the subsequent development of modern painting, believing it too narrow and that it scorned nature. So no matter how much he decried the burgeoning movement of modernism, which is what he's referring to here, he would have been very aware of what was happening in modernism and an up-and-coming school of artists championed by photographer and gallery owner Alfred Stieglitz. And these artists were people like George O'Keeffe, John Marin, Arthur Dove, Marsden Hartley. And although these well-known artists really fall pretty squarely into the modernist camp, it would be a mischaracterization to claim that they scorned nature. And in fact, I contend that these artists were in many ways somewhat like kindred spirits to Harlan Hubbard, especially when they worked in watercolor, but we'll get to that in a moment. So as I've already alluded, Harlan and his mother did not end up staying in New York City. Neither did his brother Lucian. Frank is the only one who ended up staying and living the rest of his life in New York. Lucian actually ended up becoming just as a side note, becoming a very successful Hollywood producer of motion pictures. He was one of the producers on the first Academy Award winner, which was Wings. So he lived a very different life than Harlan, which is a very interesting story. But Harlan and his mother also didn't end up staying in New York City. And in 1919, they moved back to Kentucky, settling in Fort Thomas, where Harlan built them the home that I was mentioning at the beginning of this, and settled into a life of, at least to Harlan, kind of agonizing mundanity. He studied briefly at the Cincinnati Art Institute, but soon he gave up any sort of formal artistic education. He really wanted to forge his own path there and chose to develop his style on his own through his own curriculum. And he did this by also working as a contractor, as I mentioned, to support his mother and himself. But he did continue to attend Cincinnati art openings and through a lifelong correspondence with his brother Frank, often debating art theory. Frank would send him postcards, exhibit catalogs. He would send him books, newspapers, magazines out of New York. Harlan Hubbard really kept abreast of what was going on and how the course of art was moving. And he spent this time while he was living this life that didn't thrill him. This would have been the 1920s and 30s and into the early 1940s, trying to understand where his work fit, how he knew it mattered to him, who else did it matter to. And he tried to work a lot of these thoughts out in his journals, and his journals are just an incredible boon to anyone wishing to study Hubbard's life, because he shared so much in his journals, and only a portion of them have been transcribed and published. But there are many, many, many more journals available in all kinds of archives in the region. But in 1933, he said, "It is strange that I should go on painting as I do when my work seems contrary to the progress of art. But I cannot change it. I have tried. It is as natural as my arm. So now, instead of trying to follow the rest, I cherish and try to justify my own painting. With me, it is still a representation of what I see, not consciously distorted. It is realistic, sentimental, and emotional, but there is in it a feeling, abstract design, a definite philosophy. These things are the spirit, the body of which is the representation of what I see." And this is a pretty classic example of when Harlan can contradict himself several times within the space of a very short paragraph, because he was constantly battling this idea of what his art was, where it fit, what his style was. The battle between representation and non-representation, figurative, non-figurative, realistic, abstract, is really at the core of Hubbard's work, especially in his watercolors. And a watercolor like the one that's shown here on the screen from Bill and Flo's collection, this is in the book, it feels very strongly tied to realism, much like the work of Edward Hopper. This does remind me of a Hopper. That it was still concerned with the concrete details of the subject at hand. So Hubbard gives us defined gables and windows, balconies and finials. And even if the style is somewhat loose and simple as befits watercolor, we know what we're looking at pretty quickly. And it's really somewhat closer to the kind of work he generally did in oil, much more polished, more distinct, more realistic. As in this beautiful piece from Hanover College's collection. It's actually my favorite piece in their collection, called Mules and Freight Train. But even in his study for this painting, which actually exists in Bill and Flo's collection and is also in this book, it reveals Hubbard's innate capacity for abstraction and non-figuration. So here's the study for that piece. And what would eventually become in the oil a billowing, articulated puff of white steam from the locomotive begins in the watercolor sketch as just an opaque black squiggle, ending in this really subtle and arresting extra dab of water that sort of carries that idea of steam into your mind. What would materialize into defined boxcars or hills in the oil are simply floating fields of color, applied with the confidence of an artist who really can demonstrate what he sees with the slightest movement of a brush on paper. And it's this kind of burrowing down to essentials that most of his watercolors, and really most of the watercolors done by all of these modernist artists I've mentioned working at this same time, it's this burrowing down that they employ, this simplification. So take, for example, this undated watercolor study, also from the book, of a coal barge on the Ohio River. And really there's little detail anywhere, a few basic horizontal bands of pigment lightly applied and lower contrast colors. They suggest the coal barge rather than describing it. And as I write in the introduction, somehow, in a way that's consistent with his worldview, Hubbard steps into the 20th century with both feet firmly planted and tackles one of the biggest questions of art during this period. Although he would resist the urge to non-figuration in his oil paintings, Hubbard's watercolors danced to the rhythm of his time, slipping lithely in and out of recognizable subject matter within the space of a single piece. And speaking of rhythm of his time, take a look at this large-scale watercolor sketch that Hubbard painted. It's undated, but this is also in the Hanover College collection. And the expressive, darting, slashing, scribbling lines of watercolor, and then some volunteer lines from a ballpoint pen, makes an excellent example of how Hubbard's watercolors were absolutely in dialogue with this Alfred Stieglitz branch of modernism, whether Hubbard was conscious of it or not. And at the root of this particular branch of modernism lies the romantic spirit of the 19th century American art history, where painters in schools like the Hudson River School sought transcendence through painting the landscapes that so moved them. And all of these kindred spirits chose their personal wildernesses. That was what I named the introduction of this book, and you'll see why here. They chose their personal wildernesses where the muses spoke to them most clearly. And they created the visual companion to this vision of the sublime that we see in artists like Thomas Cole and Asher Durand of the Hudson River School, or we read in the poetry of Walt Whitman or the prose of Emerson or Thoreau. And so who were some of these kindred spirits and how can we compare? Well, many of the artists who exhibited with Alfred Stieglitz, as I mentioned, are a good place to start. And many of them had a deeper admiration of or interest in city life than Harlan Hubbard ever did. But all of them actively chose to leave the city at one point and inhabit some remote places that offered them the experience of wildness. And there they would paint, often in watercolor, and often painting over and over the same landscape landmarks that typified their personal wilderness. And perhaps the most compelling comparison, I think, is between Harlan Hubbard and John Marin. Marin was born in 1870 and active until his death in 1943, so a little older than Hubbard, not quite a contemporary, but almost. And Marin, like Hubbard, really resisted the idea of completely divorcing representation from his work. So especially when it came to the natural world that he loved, Marin was emphatic that artists should have a strong connection with the places that they painted and that they should be painted in a recognizable way. And he really wanted his works to speak emotionally to his own personal wilderness. And this is a really remarkable watercolor, I think, from John Marin from the Phillips collection. And you can see one of Marin's favorite personal wildernesses. This is Bear Mountain. This is near Lewiston, Maine. And he's created something here that manages to express both weight and lightness, bigness and smallness, existence, sublimity, figuration and non-figuration. It sits in this really interesting world where we feel all of these things pulling at one another. And he also uses these oversaturated watercolor pigments. Some of them perhaps applied directly from the tube. They're so intense. And some of the most recent scholarship on John Marin mentions that many of these pigments wouldn't have been available much earlier than when Marin was painting with them. And so some of these synthetic colors that were being created were giving him the ability to paint in these remarkable, vibrant colors. And there's also a rhythm, a structure in these. All of these characteristics that I've just described, I feel, can be seen and felt in Hubbard's watercolors as well. And perhaps the easiest way to recognize this shared visual language is through the use of black. And both Marin and Hubbard and many of the Stieglitz modernists use black in a similar way in their watercolors. And as in this painting by Arthur Dove called The Boat Houses from the Hood Museum, they take severe black outlines of watercolor and constrain these energetic fields of brightness and color. Or they slash a calligraphic sentence over a pigment watch. And it's a technique that, at least in Western art, had been discouraged. But in Eastern art had been employed liberally for centuries. And one of the last periods of Marin's artistic career actually had come to be known as his calligraphic period. And I'd argue that Hubbard, who was very interested in Eastern art and culture and design, as many of the modernists were from this school, had caught on to this visual language for his watercolors as well. Now, another important kindred spirit of Harlan Hubbard is Charles Birchfield, who was born in 1893 and died in 1967. So we're getting closer to an exact contemporary to Harlan. But Birchfield worked almost exclusively in watercolor. And like Hubbard, Birchfield's art really defies ready classification to any sort of artistic school. But his theories on the purpose and creation of art make a really remarkable analog to Hubbard's own. And he too studied at the National Academy in New York. He hated it. He hated New York. And he left very quickly after enrolling in tantalizingly close proximity to when Harlan Hubbard was there. They missed each other by about a year. Birchfield eventually retreated to the area that would become his personal wilderness, which is upstate New York, near Buffalo. And Hubbard knew and admired Charles Birchfield's work, and he wrote about it. And although there are clear stylistic departures from Hubbard in many of Birchfield's more wild, almost psychedelic explosions of synesthesia, which is a visual representation of your other senses, both Birchfield and Hubbard never really strayed from their fidelity to natural subjects. And perhaps no one can compare to Harlan Hubbard's use of watercolor quite like Walter Inglis Anderson, who was active in Louisiana and Mississippi between the years of 1903 and 1965. And as you can see, I don't necessarily mean comparing their styles of watercolor, because there's really no one who paints like Walter Inglis Anderson. But rather, I mean sort of in the terms of the reason they used watercolor and what their use of watercolor says about who they were as people. And both men integrated their art and lived their philosophy in a similar way. They were really unafraid to throw themselves into nature and worship at her feet with their hands, their feet, their hearts, their minds. They immersed themselves in this really visceral engagement with nature, where they were able to create in true symbiosis with their personal wilderness. And Anderson did not see his different roles as artist, naturalist, writer as mutually exclusive, and neither did Harlan Hubbard. And in fact, it's very similar to what I defined at the beginning of this presentation as the essence of the Hubbardian quality, this melding of the different pieces of one's life into a harmonious whole. And I've written in the introduction to the watercolor book, Hubbard's watercolors stand allied with both the past and his present in American landscape painting. In his work runs the romantic sensibility of the 19th century painters who sought transcendence. In his spirit is the same ethos shared by familiar artistic visions in 20th century landscape painting tied to place. Canonical masters such as Marston Hartley, Arthur Dove, George O'Keeffe, John Marin, and other more regional painters like Charles Birchfield and Walter Inglis Anderson. All of these painters share the Hubbardian drive to explore their natural surroundings more deeply. Those who were coming of age at the beginning of the 1900s form a like-minded cadre of independent individuals who turn to nature and to watercolor as their philosophical vessel to navigate the waters of change. And later I explain, in their effort to enter viscerally into their ecosystems, kindred spirits like Birchfield, Anderson, and Hubbard became fluent in the language of their specific waters, trees, and creatures. From it sprang a calligraphic shorthand that, though modernist in ultimate execution, surpassed academic theory and was ultimately nourished by their emotional experience in environment in what might be called sublime localism. And of course, most of us probably know now where Harlan Hubbard found his personal wilderness, and what was the engine for his version of sublime localism. And it's about 200 steps from where I'm sitting presenting to you right now in New Albany. And it's probably only a few miles from where many of you are sitting too. And of course, I'm talking about the Ohio River. And the Ohio River landscape is perhaps not quite as dramatic as the craggy beaches of Marin's, Maine, or the smooth sandstone mesas and canyons of O'Keeffe's, New Mexico. But it inspired Harlan Hubbard to create this majestic body of watercolors, perhaps even painted on occasion with Ohio River water, which to me is so poetic. And I'll close with what Hubbard liked to say about why he painted the Ohio River. And in 1935, while some of his works were on display in a Cincinnati gallery, Hubbard articulated this love for his wilderness in his journal. He says, "The paintings I have on exhibition are of the Ohio River, the country of northern Kentucky and its rural life. I have tried to portray their unique charm and character so that one would know that these scenes were along the Ohio River. In gathering material and studying the country, I have covered much of it on foot and traveled up and down the river in all sorts of boats, sketching its hills and bends, towns, boats, and people. To me, it is a beautiful country and worthy of great art." So hopefully this talk has whet your appetite for a little bit more Harlan Hubbard. And I'd like to make a shameless plug for you to find a copy of the Watercolors of Harlan Hubbard. So you can really lose yourself in these magnificent watercolor reproductions that were so well reproduced and arranged in this volume from the University Press of Kentucky. And I believe there's a promo code that's been shared for you to get a little discount from ordering directly from the press. But you can also visit your local bookstore here. It's Carmichael's. They definitely have it in stock where you can pick it up. And I'm also continually working on new research into Hubbard's life and work. And so if you want to follow along with these efforts, or if you want to get in touch with me, please go to www.harlanhubbardintheamericangrain.com or follow @driftwoodharlanhubbard on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time.
Jessica, thank you so much. This was extraordinary. Questions?
Yes.
There's some in the chat room, and I will get to them.
Sure.
But for you, from me, what is it about Harlan Hubbard that attracted you? Well, was it standing on the grounds of Hanover College and looking out at the Ohio River?
You're articulating definitely one of the things that that attracted me to him.
I think one of the most beautiful liberal arts colleges in the nation.
Absolutely. And of course, I grew up in a house with liberal arts educators. And so I have learned in my life that the liberal arts is where it's at. And Hubbard is the poster child for the liberal arts. He shows us what can happen when you open your mind to all sorts of disciplines and allow these disciplines to speak through you and to you. And so I actually came to Harlan, unlike most people, through his art first. I was an art history major at Hanover College, and I remember being in the Duggan Library there on campus, and I looked up behind the circulation desk, and there was a beautiful painting of the Point, which is that amazing view of the bends in the Ohio River that's on Hanover's campus. I said, "Who painted that?" And it just started a long, I guess it's a 12-year obsession now with Harlan and learning about him and what he can teach us about the world around us.
Here is one. What can you tell us about the upcoming biography you're writing on Harlan Hubbard, and when is it expected to be published?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking about that. As I've mentioned, there's so much to Harlan, and we have a beautiful lyrical biography of Harlan by Wendell Berry that is available for you to read, that I recommend you do read. But I really wanted to create something that was a little more comprehensive, that shared some of the new research that I've done, that has come out from conversations with all kinds of people who knew Harlan by pouring through archives. And there's so much to be shared. So this comprehensive biography is not only going to take that next step that we're really hoping will encourage more people to see why Harlan applies to them, but we'll also take a next step in trying to situate him in the place where he deserves within the canon of not only American letters, but also American pictures.
Here's a question. Why do you think Hubbard is an ideal role model for coming generations in a world of iPhones and instant communications and 24/7 work philosophies?
I think definitely in terms of, he certainly encouraged me to be more observant than perhaps current culture asks us to be more observant of our surroundings, be more observant of the people around us, and more engaged and generous to the people around us. But I also think you have to mention climate change when you talk about Harlan Hubbard, not because Harlan Hubbard was political. He wasn't. He was apolitical, but he had an ethical drive in him that forced him to create a body of work and a life that lived in harmony with the natural world in such a way that we could take notes on how he interacted with the natural world, even when he was sort of living in a limbo state of not really living on that fringe of society. He was still taking actions and working to live responsibly and ethically, and to preserve what he loved so much around him. So yeah, I think about observation and really about generosity and care, not only for other people around us, but for our world.
Here's a really good one from Dennis Jennings. Did Harlan Hubbard have any real favorite landscapes over his life? I mean by that, did he refer to anything in particular in his journals? And then Dennis says, I'm assuming that Kentucky may have been his favorite landscape subject.
That's a really good question. And yeah, it's important to note that Harlan didn't just paint the Ohio Valley. He almost exclusively painted the Ohio Valley, but that's just because he spent most of his life here. But he did a lot of traveling, especially in his early years when he was living with his mom. His mom was go get him, gotta get up and go and do something kind of person. And so she and he traveled all over the country. They traveled many times out west to visit Lucian, his brother, in Hollywood. And Hubbard mentioned multiple times how much he loved the desert landscape. That's something that really stood out to me. He loved the desert. He loved the quiet, the colors, and he loved how different it was than the Ohio River Valley. But of course, probably his most famous and most well-known antic was his trip down the Ohio and Mississippi River in a shanty boat for 9 years. And ending in the bayous of Louisiana. And the bayou was hugely interesting to him. And he created many, many watercolors in the bayou, as well as woodcuts and sketches. So yes, he liked multiple landscapes, but as you say, Ohio River Valley had his heart, and particularly when he settled at Payne Hollow, which is near Madison, Indiana, and Milton, Kentucky, where he and his wife Anna eventually settled after the shantyboat journey. There was a site near Payne Hollow called Plough Handle Point. And that was sort of his Mount Saint Victoire, that Cézanne painted over and over, Pedernal that Georgia O'Keeffe painted over and over. John Marin, we mentioned Bear Mountain that he painted over and over. Plough Handle Point was an over and over subject for him. And so I would say that's a landmark specifically here that he really loved.
How would you rank Hubbard against the other famous Kentucky watercolorist, Paul Sawyer?
Yeah, well, Sawyer is interesting, isn't he? Because he also painted on a houseboat on the Kentucky River near Frankfort, which is so cool. So there are analogs in that sense. I tend, in my personal preference, to enjoy things that skew more toward modernism than Paul Sawyer does. But of course, Paul Sawyer was creating really wonderful pieces that were very widely collected and accepted within his time. So I think it's important to say that Paul Sawyer was extremely talented, maybe not as far to my taste as possible, but yeah, he was wonderful. And there's that really interesting philosophical connection too between him and Harlan. I'm sure they probably ran into each other in the space of years when they would have been traveling on rivers together painting. So
this is from Doug Butler. What were all the mediums that Hubbard worked in?
Yeah, wow. He worked in many. He wasn't really sculptural. He never really moved into 3D unless you count the handmade frames that he created out of driftwood and found recycled wood and all that for his 2D works. But he mainly was a 2D artist. Probably his largest output was in sketches, drawings, just pencil, graphite, charcoal. Watercolors are probably the next largest kinds of works he made, but he also did hundreds of oil paintings, and he did them on a number of different kinds of surfaces. So he would paint on whatever he found. So he would paint on really nice canvases, but he also painted on masonite, on board, on all kinds of really strange surfaces. And one you really might not expect, he would paint oil on tin. And those, the Cadell's have a number of really fascinating pieces, many of them double-sided, of oil on tin that are really remarkable.
This is one from my friend Cecil Starks. Can you autograph this book, or can the Cadell's? Or do you have autograph plates that can be ordered with the book?
Yeah, there's a way to contact me through the website that I place there, and yeah, get in contact with me, and I will make arrangements for that. We were hoping, of course, for this to be in person, so you could come and get one signed in person, but unfortunately, COVID hasn't allowed us to do that. But yeah, get in contact with me, and we can work that out.
And this is from Matthew Ash, and I love it when someone compliments a presentation, and I want to read it to you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I discovered Harlan Hubbard through Wendell Berry's book, which instilled a sense of wonder, simplicity, and a deeper reverence for nature. The Watercolors of Harlan Hubbard is a treasure. Congratulations, Jessica. Isn't that nice?
Well, thank you, Matthew. And thank you to Bill and Flo, whose beautiful collection and tireless work over the years has really done such wonderful things to Harlan's legacy. And I'm really honored to have been part of this publication.
Here's one last question. The influence of his parents. I know that his father died when he was 7.
Yes.
And his mother seems to have been a profound influence, I assume, in all 3 of her sons' lives. I don't know if there was a sister or other brothers.
There was not, yeah.
But what was it about the genetic pool here that made Hubbard, Lucian, and I don't know about the other brothers, just so remarkably creative?
Yeah, that's a that's a topic that's going to be tackled heavily in this biography because
I thought as much.
yeah, not much has been written about his family, and he didn't talk much about his family. The resource that we have that is incredibly illuminating into how he felt his gene pool was affecting the way that his brothers lived their lives is this this document that he worked on and off. It's a family genealogy document, handwritten, hand-drawn by Harlan. It's about 80, 90 pages long that tells the story of his family that he worked on and off for several decades toward the end of his life. And it's illuminating because he talks about this. He says, the Hubbards, which that name obviously came from his father, Frank Sr., and the Swingles, which were his mother's maiden name. And that, just a side note, that came from Zwingli, like the great Protestant reformer. They were strict people. So the Swingles and the Hubbards, he talks about their very specific character traits and how those came down through the family into his brothers. And he talks about who of his brothers was more of a Swingle, who of his brothers was more of a Hubbard. And the Swingle line, as I said, is more severe, very focused on industriousness and being extremely successful, making money, which was very much what his mother was like. Lucian was the apple of her eye because Lucian, of course, was the most successful in a traditional sense. And so that Swingle line really ran deep in Lucian. But Frank and Harlan, which is probably why they were so close, Harlan really saw them as pure Hubbards. And the Hubbards were not about ambition, not about extreme monetary success. They had this creative soul, and he counted his father, who he only knew for a short period of time, but he counted his father as where they got this kind, gentle, caring and creative impulse that he saw in himself and saw in his brother Frank.
Can't wait to read your biography when it comes out.
Great.
I want to thank you on behalf of the Filson Historical Society and all the wonderful members who've observed this tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just going to say it. I think in my 3 years at the Filson, this is one of the top talks I've ever heard. Thank you. Good job.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. Please contact me if you have any questions. I'm available.
Thanks, everybody. We're grateful to you for your membership, your support, and your love of the Filson. Bye.